Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
My entire family went to Hawaii for Christmas, and I wasn't even invited. I didn't get a text, a call, not even a vague, "we'll miss you" message. Instead, I found out the way people in my generation seem to find out everything these days, by scrolling through social media and stumbling across a photograph of my parents, my sister Lena, and her husband Eric, all wearing matching floral shirts and holding margaritas on a balcony overlooking the ocean. I can still remember the way my stomach flipped, like I had been physically shoved backward, when I realized not only had they gone, but they had gone at Lena's request, and no one thought it was important to even mention it to me. The caption under the photo was written by my mother: "Our Christmas together, just as Lena wanted." Together. As Lena wanted. And I was nowhere in the picture. At first, I thought maybe there had been some mistake, like perhaps they had planned a small getaway and the post was misleading, or maybe it had been last minute and they assumed I couldn't make it because of work. I sat there staring at that photo for nearly an hour, reading every comment and every emoji reaction, searching for some clue that would explain how my entire family ended up celebrating the holiday in paradise without me. But the more I read, the more obvious it became. This wasn't a mix-up. It was intentional. They chose to go. They chose to leave me behind. And Lena was the one who made sure it happened. That night, while most people were exchanging gifts or enjoying leftovers from dinner, I was sitting alone in my apartment with a store-bought frozen lasagna, trying to make sense of the fact that I had been erased from my own family's Christmas. It wasn't just that they went somewhere without me, it was that they made a decision to exclude me, and then documented the joy of that decision for the world to see. There was no space for me at the table, no stocking with my name, no phone call where someone said, "Hey, it feels weird not having you here." Nothing. Just silence. And then that photo. I tried to remember the last time my family had chosen me over Lena. The truth is, I couldn't. Even as kids, she was the one who got the attention, the praise, the sympathy. If I brought home an A, it was expected. If she managed a B-, she was working so hard and got a trip to the mall. If I saved up money for my own car, it was because I was responsible. If she wrecked hers, it was because she needed help. Somewhere along the way, I became the reliable backdrop to her drama, the dependable older sister who would always figure things out while Lena's chaos sucked up the spotlight. But this was something different. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a choice that screamed, "You don't matter as much as she does." And the cruelty of it, the gall of going to Hawaii, of all places, as if they were reenacting some glossy travel magazine fantasy, while I sat in my quiet living room eating microwave food, was almost laughable. Almost. When I finally broke the silence and called my mom 2 days later, she answered the phone like nothing had happened. She told me they had just come back from a day at the beach, her voice bright and careless, like she had no idea I had seen the photos. I asked her directly why no one invited me, and she paused for only a moment before saying, "Well, honey, Lena just wanted this year to be special, you know, with the baby coming and all. We thought it would be nice to give her what she wanted." Just like that. No apology, no hesitation. As if it made perfect sense to exile me so my sister could have a picture-perfect Christmas with everyone else. I remember pressing my hand against the table in my kitchen, trying to ground myself as she spoke, because my first instinct was to scream into the phone. Instead, I kept my voice even and asked, "So it was her idea? She asked you not to invite me?" My mother didn't answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know. I could almost hear her looking at my father in the background, waiting for him to give her permission to admit it. When she finally spoke, her words were softer. Lena just felt it might be easier. Less tension. Less tension. That was her justification. My existence was apparently so inconvenient, so unpleasant, that removing me from the holiday altogether was the solution. And the fact that my parents agreed, that they packed their bags, bought the tickets, and posed for those photographs, all without thinking twice about what it would mean for me, told me exactly where I stood. I wasn't the daughter they wanted to show off. I was the one who kept everything running behind the scenes. I hung up soon after, saying I had work to do, though the truth was I just couldn't stomach another word. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the wall, and something inside me shifted. For years, I had swallowed the favoritism, the guilt trips, the endless little slights. I told myself that family was family and that it was better to stay quiet than cause trouble. But as I sat there, replaying my mother's words, Lena wanted this year to be special, I realized I had been giving them all the power. I had been the one allowing myself to be overlooked. That was the moment it hit me. They might have chosen Lena this time, but Lena was living in my house. My house. The one she and Eric had been occupying for nearly 2 years without paying a cent of rent. The one I had let them stay in because they claimed they just needed a little help getting on their feet. While I was eating a lonely frozen dinner on Christmas, my sister was sipping cocktails in Hawaii on the foundation of my generosity. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let them keep taking from me. If Lena wanted to play games, I had a card she didn't even realize I was willing to use. And when I played it, she was going to understand what it felt like to be left out, to be blindsided, to be reminded that nothing in life comes free. And maybe, just maybe, my parents were going to learn that choosing sides has consequences. When the photo haze lifted and the first clean breath finally moved through my chest, I did something I have always done when chaos comes dressed like family tradition and pretends to be love. I opened a fresh legal pad, wrote my name at the top like I was signing a contract with myself, and began listing every accommodation I had provided to my sister and her husband since the day they arrived with 3 suitcases, a box of mismatched mugs, and a story about temporary setbacks that somehow stretched across 2 full years like a piece of gum stuck to a sneaker. And as the list grew, spare bedroom painted to her taste, pantry restocked after every visit, utilities left in my name because transferring accounts felt too complicated right now, lawn service paid by me so the homeowners association would not send those smug letters, endless small rescues when their checking account acted weird. I realized I had built a comfortable raft for them and then watched them paddle it out to a private island where I was not welcome, which would have been funny if it had not been my house spooing the whole scene. Memory is a tricky accountant, but it sharpened when I let it, and I could see with unnerving clarity the moments I shrugged and gave in because it was easier to be the stable one than to argue. When Lena burned a pan and said, almost laughing, that replacing it would be your cost of doing business as a landlord, even though there was no rent and no business. When Eric told me he would fix that loose step this weekend for sure, and then 3 seasons passed like a lazy montage in a sitcom. While the step remained treacherous and I pretended to be grateful for the promise, when my mother clucked that family helps family, which sounded generous until I noticed the direction of the help never changed. Like a one-way street lined with concerned smiles and empty casserole dishes. I decided that if I was going to reclaim my dignity, I would do it without theatrics and without giving anyone a clean villain to point at, so the first move was small, almost petty, but delicious in its precision. I logged into the router, changed the Wi-Fi network name to Less Tension, set a new password only I knew, and scheduled the reboot for the morning of their return. And while it would not change the world, I wanted the first thing they experienced when they dropped their suitcases on my floors and tried to stream a show to blunt their jet lag to be an error message that said, in the language of modern life, that the free ride had silently hit a toll booth. Then I opened the folder with the house paperwork, the one that smells faintly of copier ink and adulthood, and I read through state landlord-tenant guidelines because I was not going to be reckless. And what I found was a path that would hold up if anyone tried to shame me into backing down. Written notice, delivered in a provable way, a clear date for vacating that gave them time but not comfort, and a record of the arrangement that had never been formal but had been sustained, which a judge could interpret however they liked unless I documented it well now. So I typed a letter that was firm without cruelty, stating that I would no longer provide housing without compensation and that I was terminating their right to occupy the property on a specific date after a reasonable period. And while the words felt clinical compared to the emotions that fueled them, I chose clinical on purpose because I had learned that when people expect you to cry, the sharpest blade is a calm paragraph. Before printing the letter, I made another adjustment that was more housekeeping than warfare, but still felt like a necessary cord cutting. I called the utility companies, gave the return date as a marker, and scheduled the transfer of every bill into their names, which is what any adult would expect if they were paying anything at all. And when the representative asked politely whether I wanted paperless billing to remain on my email, I said no and gave Lena's address, because a flood of account confirmations has a way of clarifying who is responsible for what, and if she found it annoying, she could take that up with the woman who had asked our parents to celebrate Christmas without me. Of course, I kept hearing my mother's phrase about less tension, like it had been stitched into the lining of every memory, and a part of me, the part that still wanted to make peace with people who had never chosen peace for me, wondered if I was being harsh. But then I remembered standing in my kitchen on Christmas night with that lasagna steaming under the crooked stove light, and I thought about the silence of my phone, and I decided that if anyone claimed I was overreacting, I would simply say that boundaries look like violence to people who benefit from you having none. Because I was not interested in giving them any chance to claim surprise, I took one more step that was both kind and merciless. I arranged with my contractor friend, who still owed me for the time I found him a subcontract when his calendar went dry, to conduct a safety inspection on the day after their return, a perfectly legitimate walkthrough to assess the loose step, the smoke detectors, and that temperamental bathroom fan, and I left a neat card on the kitchen counter with the appointment time, which meant they would have to meet a stranger in the home that was not theirs and hear him refer to me, accurately, as the owner, and if that stung, perhaps the lesson would finally land. And, because revenge, to be righteous, should always carry a note of humor that keeps you from turning into the people who hurt you, I placed a new welcome mat by the front door, rolled tight and waiting for their first shuffle inside. A simple gray rectangle with understated lettering that read, "Guests by invitation," which is not a scream, not a curse, and not a threat, but a sentence that says I have recovered my backbone. By the time their plane touched down, everything was in motion and nothing was loud, and I slept that night with the kind of heavy, even breathing I had not felt since before they arrived with their hopeful faces and their promises to be gone by summer. And when my phone rang in the late morning and my mother's name glowed on the screen like a small red warning light on a dashboard, I let it go to voicemail, then opened the front door of my own apartment to retrieve the stamped, tracked envelope that would leave my hand in an hour and wondered, not without a grin, how long it would take them to realize that the photo they had posted from paradise had marked the last day the world would be arranged to their liking, because as of now the clock was ticking. The password was changed, the bills had their names on them, and the only thing left was for them to open the door, see the mat, and feel the ground tilt just enough to understand that the island they believed was theirs had always been mine, which is when the screen lit up again, this time with Lena's call, and I answered, not to fight, but to say, in a voice that did not shake, that there was a letter on the way and she should sign for it, since we were doing things the right way from now on. They landed before noon, and by the time rideshare exhaustion carried them up my front steps, the house had already shifted one subtle degree toward reality, because the welcome mat with its quiet sentence waited like a small courtroom. The Wi-Fi had politely declined to recognize their devices, the thermostat demanded a code only I possessed, and the kitchen counter held the appointment card for the safety inspection with my contractor's neat handwriting framed by 2 stacked rolls of heavy-duty moving tape I had placed there like a prophecy, and even though none of those things were cruel in themselves, together they formed the kind of sentence that makes people stop pretending the situation is complicated and start admitting it is simply over. Lena opened the door with that tired little huff she uses when the world disappoints her by being governed by gravity and bills, and she saw the mat first, then the card, then the Wi-Fi name blinking, less tension on her phone like a private joke written in public letters, and when she called my name through the house with that old command in her voice, I did not answer, because I was not there to absorb her first blast of indignation. Instead, I watched, thanks to the doorbell camera that I had finally set to record, as her expression shifted from confusion to insult to calculation in about 8 seconds, the exact time it took her to find the envelope I had FedExed to arrive the day they did, the one with the termination notice. the tracking number, and the clear date circled in plain language that even her talent for denial could not dissolve. Eric tried to play the diplomat the way some men do when they realize their charm has bounced off the surface of consequences. And he called me with a steady tone that I had learned to interpret as "please rescue me from the woman I encouraged to spend 2 years living rent-free." And he said this was all a misunderstanding, and that they had planned to talk to me right after the holidays, and that they were going to start paying something soon, which sounded like someone dropping a coin into a jar after drinking from a well for 2 years. So I told him, calmly and without heat, that misunderstanding ends when paper arrives with dates on it, that starting to pay something is not the same as being a tenant, and that we would either sign a market-rate lease with deposit by the date listed in the letter, or they would vacate by the later date listed. And I could hear him flip through the pages as if the firmness of the font might soften if he found the right clause to lean on. My phone lit with my mother's name, and I let it ring because I knew exactly what script she would audition, that sad sweet mixture of concern and mild accusation where she tells me she understands my feelings, but this is not the time to be difficult. Not with Lena expecting, not with stress in the air, and every time she said expecting I felt the old family magic trick attempt to happen again, the one where a baby becomes a wand that erases accountability, but I had prepared for that line before it left anyone's mouth, and my preparation did not involve a scream or a door slammed or a pitying speech. It involved a printed reservation for a furnished month-to-month studio 3 miles away with a quiet courtyard and a working elevator. Already paid for the first month with move-in any day before the notice period even began, and I placed the reservation voucher in a second envelope labeled Option A, and added a clean draft of a lease labeled Option B, and when I finally called my mother back, I told her, steadily and kindly, that a pregnant woman should never be forced to live somewhere she is not wanted, which is why I had secured safe, private housing. And that if this felt harsh, it was only because the era of me being an inexhaustible resource had ended. The sound Lena made when she realized I had not only withdrawn the free ride, but also neutralized her favorite weapon, public martyrdom, was a brittle laugh that slid quickly into a sharper register, and she said I would not actually do this. And she said our parents would never speak to me if I did, and she said a judge would call me heartless, and I answered each prediction with the same sentence, which was that I had followed the statute, I had provided alternatives, and I had made my decision. And then I added, almost gently, that the only reason a person calls a boundary cruelty is because they have grown accustomed to having free keys to your life. Eric tried, bless him and his eternal spreadsheet of half measures, to negotiate smaller terms, a partial rent now, a repayment plan later, a promise that the utilities in their names could be symbolic until they stabilized. And I told him symbolism is what families use when they want to borrow your spine, but I was done lending it, and I reminded him that the inspection tomorrow was not a threat but a courtesy, because if they chose Option B, the lease would require those repairs anyway, and if they chose Option A, the contractor would document the property's condition for my records before they left, which is how grown-ups do things when the season for fairy tales is over. By evening, the group thread had turned into a small courtroom where my parents tried to adjourn the case on feelings, forwarding photos from Hawaii as if to prove that Lena's happiness was a family project I had selfishly undermined. And I replied with a single message that did not mention Christmas or margaritas or matching shirts, only the 2 options, the 2 dates, and the name of the building manager for the studio who would hand over keys upon presentation of the voucher I had enclosed. And I watched the little typing bubbles flare and vanish like fireflies that cannot quite commit to shining. When the doorbell rang the next morning and the contractor stood with his clipboard, the camera captured the smallest turn in Lena's posture, that inward flinch you see when someone has to pretend they are the host in a home that is not theirs. And while he moved through the hallway pointing at the loose step and the sleepy smoke detector, I waited in my car at the curb with the second set of documents in my bag and a pen that clicked with the satisfying promise of clean signatures, and when my phone finally buzzed with a message from an unknown number that turned out to be the building manager saying he had just seen my sister in his lobby holding the voucher and asking for a tour for a friend, I smiled without triumph, because this was not about winning. It was about ending, and as I stepped out of the car and walked toward my own front door to meet them at last, the group thread chimed again with my father's three-knock text, his prelude to an intervention, and I lifted the latch. Thinking that if this was the moment they tried to force a third option I had not offered, they were about to learn that the only door still open was the one that led either to Elise or to the elevator of that quiet studio, and nothing in between. My father arrived first with that solemn look he reserves for funerals and tax meetings, the look that says he intends to speak in reasonable tones while escorting me back toward the role where my feelings are admirable in theory and expendable in practice. And behind him came my mother, whose eyes already brimmed with the soft shine of a woman preparing to deploy the oldest family weapon, the suggestion that love means yielding, while Lena hovered on the steps with Eric at her elbow, their luggage still scabbed with airline tags and their faces arranged into a tableau of weary virtue. As if the long flight had been a pilgrimage that wiped clean the slate of 2 years of rentlessness and the small matter of an exile Christmas, they curated with giddy attention to detail. I held the door because I am not an animal and because I wanted the record to show that hospitality is not the same as surrender. Then I led them into the living room where the inspection report sat on the coffee table. Like a neutral witness, the contractor's notes crisp and fair, no melodrama, only bulletproof observations about the loose step, the groaning bathroom fan, the window latch that had become decorative rather than functional. All of which would be repaired soon whether they chose the lease or the studio. My father began with a biography of our family as he prefers to remember it, a moving portrait where generosity is a river running from the parents to the children and back again whenever necessary. And he asked me to see this moment as a bend in that river, a time to extend grace, especially because a child is on the way and stress burns through savings the way the sun burns through afternoon cloud. And while he spoke with that calm rhythm I had once loved, because it meant someone else was guiding the boat, I looked at the 2 envelopes on the table and thought about how every river has banks and floods are only romantic until you are ankle-deep in someone else's negligence. When he paused for my agreement, I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that nothing in this house had been reciprocal for a very long time, that my silence had not been consent but exhaustion, and that I was only enforcing what should never have been exceptional in the first place, which was a boundary. My mother tried a different key, softening her voice until it became a nearly musical fog, reminding me that sisters are forever and resentment ages the heart, then pivoted toward the suggestion that perhaps I had misunderstood the Hawaii situation. Because Lena had only wanted a stress-free holiday after a year of nausea and restless nights, and I said I admired the courage it takes to rebrand exclusion as healthcare, but the caption under her photo had not been an insurance code, and whether they called it tranquility or tradition, the result was the same, which is that I opened a frozen dinner alone while my family toasted the horizon, and it is a strange sermon indeed that asks me to repent for taking myself seriously after seeing that. My mother blinked, steadied herself, and produced the phrase every parent eventually reaches for when their preferred child meets a wall, that we are all only human and mistakes happen, and I agreed, then added that I too was only human and my mistake had been thinking I was a resource rather than a person, a miscalculation I was correcting now. Lena finally stepped forward with a lawyerly sigh, said she was willing to be reasonable if I would be reasonable, by which she meant she could start paying a token amount for a few months until after the birth, at which point they would reassess, and she would also let the utilities remain in my name so nothing got messed up with accounts during what she called a medically delicate season, and I said that reasonableness is measurable, not ornamental, and that a token is not rent. Reassessment is not a plan, and my email inbox is not a nursery. Then I placed in her hand the lease with the market rate amount already typed and the deposit figure printed clearly in words because clarity matters. And I explained the calendar I had outlined in the notice, which gave them a fair period to decide and an equally fair period to vacate if they chose the studio, and I reminded her that I had covered the first month there. Not to punish her, but to spare the unborn child the stress of a home where every drawer opening is an argument. Eric, who had been scanning the inspection sheet like it might confess a loophole, asked whether the repairs could be used as leverage against the rent timeline. then suggested that if I truly wanted unity, I could consider forgiving the backlog of utilities to give them a clean slate, and I said I had already considered unity, which is why I had not filed for back payment even though I could document the expenses line by line, and that mercy unrecognized hardens into entitlement, which is its own kind of poison. I then added, gently but very clearly, that I had scheduled a professional move-out service for the final day of the notice period with an optional extension for the following morning, and that any items unclaimed by the end of that window would be handled under the abandoned property guideline the statute respectfully outlines, which was not a threat but a clock. And if they signed the lease today, I would cancel that appointment with a single phone call and happily forward the contractor schedule instead. My father rubbed his temples and asked whether I was truly prepared to let the family fracture over what he called paperwork, and I told him the fracture had happened when a decision was made on an island to trim the family photograph until it fit a certain mood, and that the paperwork was me choosing to stop bleeding unseen, and at that his face changed, not in defeat but in recognition, as if he finally understood that the old symmetry had broken and would not be coaxed back. He nodded once, which is his closest version of respect, and said that he would drive Lena to see the studio, that he hoped she would pick it so we could all breathe without barbed wire in our lungs, and he warned me, almost fatherly again, that our mother would not accept this lightly, that she would escalate, and I thanked him and said I was ready with patience and documents, but not with apology. The day sagged under its own weight, yet I kept one promise to myself, which was that every chapter of consequence would end with a small, deliberate action that made me feel less like a defendant and more like a citizen. So after they left, I walked to the garage, photographed each shelf and bin for the condition log, labeled the boxes that were mine with fresh tape and tidy handwriting, and emailed a copy of the inspection report to my own account like a postcard from the future telling me I had handled this like a grown woman rather than a martyr. Minutes later, my phone vibrated with a message from a number I did not recognize, an image attachment followed by one curt sentence. And when I opened it, I saw a screenshot of a text thread between my mother and Lena dated before the holiday, where my mother wrote that inviting me would complicate the trip and that it was better to keep the circle small until after the baby. And beneath it, Lena had added a thumbs up and a heart, which is the kind of tenderness that draws blood, and as I stared at that neat little proof that the story I had been told was not softened truth but curated fiction, another message arrived from my mother herself asking me to come to dinner like old times, so we could talk this out calmly, and I typed a reply that was neither cruel nor forgiving, simply a meeting time for the following night at a public place with good lighting, because if we were going to exhume what actually happened, I wanted witnesses made of ordinary people eating soup, and I ended the message with one sentence that surprised even me by how light it felt. Bring every version of the story you have, because I have one too, and they are not the same. The dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock at a modest Italian place near downtown, the sort of neutral territory that made conversation possible because no one could slam doors or retreat to bedrooms. And when I arrived, my parents were already seated in a booth under the weak glow of a chandelier that had seen better decades, while Lena and Eric sat across from them looking like defendants awaiting arraignment, their hands resting on the table but not touching, as if they understood that even small displays of unity could be read as provocation. I took the empty seat directly across from my mother so that when the inevitable distortions came I would see her eyes. The same ones that had once softened when I scraped my knee but now hardened every time I insisted on truth, and for a moment we all sat there in the clatter of forks and low conversations from other diners. A family-shaped object pretending to be whole while fractures ran silently through the grain. The first volley was gentle, almost rehearsed, my mother thanking me for agreeing to meet, saying she wanted nothing more than peace, and for a second I considered letting her have the illusion. But then I remembered the screenshot that had arrived on my phone. The evidence that the story of Hawaii had been constructed with deliberate exclusion, and I leaned forward and told her plainly that I had seen her message to Lena, the one where she wrote that inviting me would complicate the trip. And that no matter how kindly she wrapped her words now, I knew the truth had not been oversight or miscommunication, but choice, a choice to erase me so that the photograph would look the way they wanted. And the silence that followed was so complete I could hear the waiter's shoes squeak 3 booths away. My father tried to intervene with a measured sigh, saying I was making too much of a single text, that family logistics are messy and intentions often get lost. But I stopped him by reminding him that I had spent Christmas alone with a frozen dinner not because flights were expensive or timing was difficult, but because my sister wanted a holiday where I did not exist, and they complied. And I told him that if he thought that was a small detail, then he had misunderstood what small means. Because small is forgetting to bring dessert, not cutting out your daughter like she is a blemish in the background of paradise, and for once he did not reply immediately, because somewhere inside he knew the difference. Lena, never comfortable with silences that make her less than central, leaned forward with her best imitation of magnanimity, declaring that she had only wanted to avoid stress during her pregnancy, that she had asked for a smaller circle for health reasons, and that if I had taken offense she was sorry I felt that way, a phrase so perfectly engineered to avoid responsibility it nearly made me laugh out loud. And I told her that my feelings were not an accident but a reaction, that offense was not the word for what happens when your own sister writes your absence into the script of a family holiday, and that her apology was like handing me a glass of water after burning down my house, unnecessary because the damage had already been done. The conversation swelled like a storm tide then, with my mother pleading for me to reconsider the eviction, reminding me of Lena's condition, reminding me of the baby who deserved stability, reminding me that family should be safe harbor. And I responded with a steadiness I had practiced in private, telling her that the baby would have stability, either through a properly signed and honored like any other adults would, or through the studio apartment already arranged and paid for, but that my home would no longer be their consequence-free playground, and if she could not accept that, it was her discomfort to manage, not mine, because I had finally chosen myself after years of choosing everyone else. And the look that crossed her face then was not disappointment but shock, as though she had never considered the possibility that I might one day stop playing the role they had written for me. Eric, in his soft, conciliatory voice, said we were at a crossroads where one generous gesture could heal everything, and I looked him in the eye and said that generosity without respect is exploitation dressed as grace, and that I had no interest in healing a wound by pretending it had not been inflicted, and for the first time that evening he had nothing to say, his gaze dropping to the table like a man reading the verdict in advance. We sat for another half-hour, words rising and falling, promises made without sincerity, accusations floated and then withdrawn, but beneath it all the truth stood firm. The eviction clock was ticking, and no amount of sentiment could rewind it. When the plates were cleared and the check arrived, my father reached for his wallet as he always did, but I placed my card down before he could, a gesture not of defiance but of ownership, as if to say the evening had been mine to endure and therefore mine to close. And while the waiter walked away, my mother reached across the table, her hand hovering above mine but not quite touching, and she whispered that I was breaking the family, and I told her quietly, without anger, that the break had already happened the moment they boarded that plane to Hawaii without me, and all I was doing now was refusing to glue together a vase that had been shattered on purpose. When I left the restaurant, the air outside was cool and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs sting, but also reminds you that you are alive, and as I walked to my car I thought about what would come next, about whether they would sign the lease, whether they would move into the studio, whether my parents would eventually thaw or choose permanent distance, and for the first time in months I realized the not knowing did not terrify me, because uncertainty is lighter than betrayal, and silence, when chosen, is a language all its own. I drove home without turning on the radio, let the quiet settle like a second skin, and as I pulled into the driveway and saw the faint outline of the welcome mat at my door, those words, guests by invitation, caught the streetlight and glowed faintly. And I understood that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a different one, where my role was not caretaker or scapegoat but author, and where the final chapter remained unwritten, hovering in that strange space between justice And reconciliation, a space where perhaps one day answers would come, but for now the only truth I needed was that I had chosen myself, and that was enough.